Greetings and welcome back. In the last mini lecture, I began talking about power, the currency of politics, and there are a few things that stand out that are probably most noteworthy for exam purposes. Obviously, power is important. In fact, in the notes it says power is the most important concept in political science, and I probably will ask that question. What is the most important concept in political science? And its power, because it's a currency. And what I mean by a currency is that in the economic world, currency or money buys you commodities that you want. In the political world, power often buys you the things that you want. And the major observation, or probably the major theme of the last lecture, was don't get caught in the trap in believing that power and force are the same thing. Certainly, force can provide power, right? And I talked about how it's the violent exercise of power, war, rioting, violence, assassination, whatever it happens to be. But in the real world, most power is exerted non-physically through persuasion, through manipulation, and as I told you in the last mini lecture, through my personal favorite, which is exchange. I will do this for you in exchange. Maybe you'll do this for me. And I know as a negotiator, and I've negotiated multiple contracts, this often occurs where you have to bargain and compromise and give up something in order to get something else that you would like for yourself. To me, that is the major, absolute number one theme of the United States' Constitutional Convention in 1787. You have people who don't like each other, who don't trust one another, and yet they were able to engage in exchange. I'll give you this if you in return will get me that. And so I think that exchange is very, very common. In this mini lecture, I want to move the discussion towards government. And here I'm discussing the header governments and power. And there are three concepts here that you probably should know. The first two are more important than the third. And the reason is that I'm going to use the term legitimacy and sovereignty throughout the course. I probably won't use authority very often, although perhaps I may from time to time. So let's turn to that first concept, legitimacy. Legitimacy is the mass feeling that the government's rule is rightful, in parentheses, respect for government. And in American government, I like to use the example that as long as a leader in a government has legitimacy, there is not going to be an open revolution. There may be some insurrection, there may be a revolt. But for example, in the case of the colonies in the United States, there was turmoil between British rule under King George III and the colonists going all the way back to the Stamp Act in 1765. And yet we do not get the Declaration of Independence for over a decade, 1776. And I've often been asked, well, why is that? Why did this fester for so long? And the reason is that even though many colonists believed that King George III was a bad king, and in fact was derisively called Fat George by many, the belief was he was a bad king, but he was our king. And the hope was that he would become a better king over time, and we just had to bargain with him and get him to see the light, so to speak. This changes drastically in January of 1776. Thomas Paine writes the famous pamphlet Common Sense. And for the first time, Thomas Paine not only says that King George III is a bad king. Lots of people were doing that. But he questions whether King George III is legitimate, right? He says, how strange it is that an island thinks it should govern a continent when all common sense says that it is a continent that should govern an island. The idea of an island governing a continent makes about as much sense as a tail wagging a dog, when we all know that it is a dog that wags its tail. And so Paine's common sense was really the prerequisite, I would argue, to the Declaration of Independence. There is not going to be an American Revolution as long as there is a perception. And once again, in politics, perception is more important than reality, because people engage in political behavior based on their perceptions, not based on reality. So common sense changes the perception of many people. Not a majority, believe it or not, even during the Revolutionary War, a majority of the colonists actually stay loyal to Britain. It is a minority, but it is a large minority. So the notion that Thomas Paine instilled in many people, that King George III was illegitimate, eventually spawns a revolution that is truly important, not only for American history, but for world history, because it was the first time in the history of the world that a country separated itself from its mother country. Now, I ended this concept of legitimacy with an observation and a question. And what I wrote, and you can read it, there are very few police officers in Scandinavia. Is this proof of governmental legitimacy? In other words, if you have people who believe that the government is legitimate, that the laws are legitimate, then lawlessness is going to be relatively minimal. And so crime is much lower in Scandinavia than in the United States. And there are far fewer police officers in Scandinavian countries than in the United States. So is there a perception in Scandinavia that government, its leadership, and its laws are more legitimate than ours? And that's one that I will let you ponder and think about, and perhaps I will come back to this concept later on. The second crucial concept that I want you to come to grips with is this notion of sovereignty. Sovereignty is the power of the government to rule over its territory. And here, most political commentators only discuss internal sovereignty, and clearly this is important. I remember many years ago watching a newscast, and the newscaster said in, I believe it was in Yemen, that the government only had control of a few blocks, and I forgot how many, 6, 8, whatever it happened to be, blocks around the presidential palace and capital of Yemen. And so certainly this is an important concept, that you have the power to rule over its own territory. But I would add, maybe even more important, is a country needs external sovereignty. And let me give you an example of a country that for decades had internal sovereignty, but did not have external sovereignty. And I'll use a good friend of mine to illustrate this. After World War II, in the country of Iran, there was a controversial leader. He was a socialist. His name was Mossadegh. And there was a fear in the United States that Mossadegh was a socialist, and that if Mossadegh were elected, he may form close ties to the Soviet Union. Mossadegh was elected in an election legitimately. He was the legitimate leader of Iran. The United States feared this leadership, and so the CIA staged a coup. And so the United States government deposed a popularly elected leader and put a man who became known as the Shah of Iran on the throne. My best friend in college was a little bit older than me. I worked at a bar and card room, and my nickname for him was Low Ball Mo. His real name was Mosin. And he was an engineer. He came from a very wealthy family in Iran. And when the Iranian Revolution took place and the Shah of Iran was deposed and Ayatollah Khomeini took over, Mo said, "Richard, I'm surprised that the Shah lasted as long as he did." He said, "Richard, my dad was an oil man. We were involved in a joint venture with the British Petroleum Company. The Shah knew my dad knew the Shah. We were friends of his. But the Shah was not legitimate. He really was not our leader. He was America's leader. And the only reason that the Shah stayed in power was because the United States armed him to the teeth, and he ruled the country with a certain amount of fear and terror. But the Shah was highly dependent on the United States, and therefore the country did not have external sovereignty." My friend Mo said that I liked the Shah, but he was never the legitimate leader of our country. And as long as an American coup was responsible for our leader, our country was never truly sovereign. Our country was only a country. Our leader was only a leader because of the United States. And so if you're going to look at sovereignty, yes, you need to look at, does the country have the power to rule over its own territory? But another element of sovereignty is, how independent is that government? Is that government free to govern itself without undue influence from another country? Now, don't be naive here. All countries, especially smaller countries, are subject to some influence. And all countries, even large countries, are subject to certain influence, especially if you look at economics, for example, from the policies of other countries. But we're talking about how much influence. So, for example, Panama. Panama was part of Colombia. The constitution of the country was originally written in I believe, a hotel room in San Francisco, and the United States recognized the Panamanian government only a few hours after they declared independence. For many years, the United States had tremendous influence over Panama, and so Panama's sovereignty was somewhat limited by the power of the United States. The last concept, and I'm not going to say much here, is authority, the psychological ability of leaders to get them to obey them. Certainly, you notice the connection to legitimacy. To me, one of the things that's absolutely amazing, even about someone like President Trump, who, in my mind, has not been a very good president. That's an opinion of mine. It's not a fact. But one of the things that absolutely amazes me is the incredible authority that President Trump has over his followers. There are a group of people who are incredibly devoted to President Trump. He has more authority over his base, maybe, than any president of my lifetime. So those are the three concepts involving governments and power. Legitimacy and sovereignty will probably appear on the exam. Authority could, but probably won't. In the next mini lecture, we're going to turn the page to a new page called Politics and Government, and I will be back on screen soon. Have a wonderful day, everyone.